Hey everyone. So, about a year ago, I needed an SSD for an older laptop. I wanted better performance out of the thing, but didn't have a lot to spend at the time. And after a bit of searching, I took a chance on a 128GB A2 series model from a company called Biwin Storage Technology Limited. Now, I'd never heard of them before, but the price was right around my budget, and I trusted what I'd read about the drive enough to bite the bullet. Fast forward 1 year later, and so far the drive has performed flawlessly. Today, I have with me a 120GB A3 series model, which I'm itching to try out. This, as expected, is SATA3 6GB per second compatible with Smart, NCQ, and Trim. Of course, you'd expect it to work with all modern operating systems as listed on the box. Anyway, I really needed to figure out how to pronounce the name of the company and to get some specifications on the drive, so I emailed them. And according to Biwin, the A3 120GB is rated at read speeds of 563 megabytes per second and write speeds of 452 megabytes per second. Now, as you'd expect, I've gone ahead and done some testing. Let's see what I found. Okay, so first off, I installed the drive into an Asus ROG GL552VW gaming laptop and fired it up. This laptop does have SATA 3 and comes equipped with an i7 6700HQ CPU with 16 gigs of RAM. So as expected, on a fresh Windows 10 installation, boot up was pretty fast at 14 seconds. Now, since numbers are all the rage these days, let's get right into that. On Crystal Diskmark, the scores were around 500 megabytes per second on read speed and 332 megabytes per second on write speed. So that's about 63 megabytes per second less on read speeds, with write speeds coming in at around 106 megabytes per second less than what the drive was actually rated at. Personally, I think that's pretty good. And while there are a few things which can affect these numbers, honestly, I'm much more interested in how the drive performs in a real-world situation. Okay, so really quick and just for reference, let's launch Ableton Live and see how quickly that starts. That loads up in about 6 seconds. Great. Let's keep that in mind for later. Okay, now let's face it. Not everybody has a gaming laptop with a zippy 2.6 GHz quad-core CPU and 16 gigs of RAM. So with that in mind, I've decided to do some tests on less capable hardware and also through SATA 2 interfaces. Let's check that out. So I've decided to do something a little crazy with this review. Taking a system fitted with a 10,000 RPM Western Digital Raptor drive, I committed a sin of sorts and went ahead and cloned that pre-existing installation right onto the Biwin SSD. I tested that to see if I got better performance, if any, and ran some benchmarks just for fun, expecting really only marginal improvements. Let's see how that went. In the background, the system is booting from the Western Digital Raptor, while in the top right corner, it's booting from the Biwin SSD. You'll notice that the SSD starts up a bit faster, and in fact, when I ran the benchmark, I got read and write speeds of 102.4 and 111.7 on the Raptor, while the Biwin came in at 276.6 and 236.9, more than double as expected. Now, I like real-world practical tests over benchmarks, so that means running some programs. Would an Excel launches faster? No surprise there, but a better test would be to launch programs like Camtasia, Ableton Live, and RealFlight, as those generally take much longer to start up. So, quick backtrack. The Western Digital 10,000 RPM Raptor system took about 1 minute and 30 seconds to boot, and that same installation when cloned onto the Biwin SSD took about 1 minute and 22 seconds. While testing programs, Camtasia showed startup times of between 18 to 20 seconds on the WD Raptor and 12 to 14 seconds on the Biwin SSD. Ableton showed times of between 32 to 34 seconds startup on the Raptor and 22 to 24 seconds on the Biwin SSD, a full 10 seconds less, which pales in comparison really when you consider that it started up in about 6 seconds on the Asus laptop. And finally, RealFlight took about 24 to 26 seconds on the Western Digital Raptor, while only taking 15 to 16 seconds on the Biwin SSD. Again, 10 seconds less with the SSD. In fact, you might notice from the video that even though I launched real flight from the SSD a few moments after launching it off the Raptor, not only did it launch first off of the SSD, but I could almost start and shut down real flight 2 times in a row on the SSD before doing the same thing on the Western Digital Raptor. Of course, we have to keep in mind that this is a clone of a very old install. Also, we are running off of SATA2, so I am expecting a performance drop to less than what the drive is truly capable of. A fact which was quite evident when Ableton Live took nearly 24 seconds to launch on the clone installation and SATA2 interface, as opposed to 6 seconds when paired with a fresh installation on an SATA3 interface. Still, I am impressed that I was able to get even more performance out of the system. Remember, it's running from a Raptor. This is a 10,000 RPM drive, which is significantly faster than the average 7,200 RPM drive. The thing is no slouch. Frankly, the performance difference would have been greater had I done this comparison between a 7,200 RPM drive and the Biwin SSD. But I know that some will say that this is an unfair comparison, and you're right. So I've gone and done a fresh installation of Windows 7 and Ableton Live. Let's check that out. In the background, I've got the fresh installation of Windows 7 running from the Biwin SSD. In the top right corner, I have the dirty clone installation with the same SSD booting from the same SATA2 system. If you remember earlier, the dirty install took 1 minute and 22 seconds. The fresh installation with no drivers only took 27 seconds to start up. On this fresh installation, Ableton Live took only 6 to 11 seconds to start up. Compare that to 6 seconds on the SATA3 system, and you can see clearly why I prefer real-world performance tests rather than benchmarks. Yes, I hear you. It's still not fair. I need a fresh installation on the Raptor as well. Well, considering that I can't do that right now, I'll offer this instead. Earlier in this video, I showed you the Biwin SSD booting up Windows 10 in 14 seconds on an Asus SATA3 laptop. That same Biwin will boot Windows 7, a slower booting operating system than Windows 10, in 27 seconds. Earlier, I also showed you Ableton Live launching in 6 seconds on an SATA3 system. Here, I've shown Ableton Live launching in 6 to 11 seconds on an SATA2 system, a difference of only 5 seconds. Take a look at these benchmarks again. Notice the difference in speeds? Consider how this translates in a real-world test, and you'll see why those numbers only tell part of the story. But what about with Windows 10 using SATA2? Well, I tried that as well on an Acer 7741G laptop fitted with a quad-core i7 Q740 1.73 GHz CPU and 8 gigs of RAM. That system started up in about 23 seconds. Ableton Live launched in about 10 seconds. Of course, things are never quite complete without some numbers, so I benchmarked the Biwin on the Acer 7741G and compared that to the SATA3 Asus ROG, just in case you were curious. Despite SATA3 theoretically being double the speed of SATA2, real-world tests on fresh installations are actually reasonably similar, with differences of about 10 seconds. At the time of this review, the Biwin A3 series SSD retailed for about $40.99, while the most recent offerings of similar capacities by other brands were for quite a bit more. So, wrapping things up, would I recommend this Biwin 120GB SSD on a modern system with an SATA3 interface as a boot drive for just your operating system and some key software? Hey, if you're looking at this capacity, you're likely on a budget anyway. You don't need to spend $90 plus on the premium brands for great performance, so yes. To breathe new life into an older system with an SATA2 interface, especially for those of you who like to distro hop on older laptops for your Linux experiments. Seriously, stop fiddling around with booting from fun drives. This is affordable. Hell yes, I recommend this. As I've said, I've had the A2 series for a year. It's been rock solid so far, and I expect the same from this one. So for me, this A3 series SSD from Biwin is a win. Thanks for watching.